which, sorry, I got the little recording and process thing.
Oh,
there.
sorry.
But yeah, you're okay. Yeah. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Brian Rhinehart. I'm happy to be here tonight. Looks like we have a good turnout, so we should have a good presentation here tonight. Just a little bit about me, just real quick before I start. I'm a professional genealogist, and I make a bulk of my living doing research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They've been closed down for over a year because of COVID, so I'm happy to be able to be doing some presentations to keep busy. Anxiously awaiting them reopening so I can get back to work. Behind me, this is a virtual background, which is why my hands kind of disappear when I hold them up. This is the National Archives research room behind me. If you've ever been to the National Archives, you may recognize that room. This window right there, that's Pennsylvania Avenue. You may have heard of that. That's where the White House is. And White House is down the road one way, about a half mile, quarter mile. The Capitol building is about a half mile, quarter mile the other direction, okay, right in the heart of town. So it's a great place to be. I would recommend that you guys all go there. And you're going to learn a little bit about some of the Civil War records that might be there tonight. We'll touch on them briefly. Just one thing, I'm going to start the presentation here in a minute, just to let you guys know. I was telling Nancy this before everybody joined. I had surgery on my vocal cords a couple months ago. Recovery has been a little bit slower than I had liked. So I could probably do the entire presentation fine. But whenever I get asked to do a presentation that I already have recorded, it's much easier for me, the strain on my voice, and probably for your own ears, having to listen to me talking, if I switch over and play the recorded version. I'm going to do that tonight. I'll be here for the whole thing. I'll come back at the end, take questions live. It's just much easier for me to be able to do that instead of try to strain my voice and talk for an hour. So I appreciate your understanding on that. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the recording. If you haven't already, you can mute your microphones so we don't hear your dog barking or your Doritos munching during the talk. So, all right, here we go. Hey everyone, my name's Brian Rhinehart, and I help people find their ancestors at the National Archives. I've spent countless hours there at the National Archives, helping people get information about their military ancestors there. Since I focus mainly on the Civil War and the War of 1812, I get a lot of questions from people. One of the most common questions, some sort of variation of wondering how to know if they even have a Civil War ancestor. So in the course of answering this question for people, I've used a lot of the same resources over and over again. So I thought I'd share some of those resources with you guys here today. Some of these sources might be kind of obvious ones to you, but I'm hoping that I can share at least one or two new ideas, if not more, that you can go back and use in your own family tree and in your own research to help narrow down if you have a military ancestor in your family tree. After we look at some of these resources that are available, I'm going to show you a case study of how these resources can be used to help narrow down some of those pesky common named ancestors in your tree. Keep in mind too, these tips, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. There's a lot of places out there that you can find names of Civil War ancestors. I'm not going to be able to mention all of them. I'm going to try to focus a little more on ones that might be readily available through online research. But even then, there's going to be places to research beyond what I'm saying here. So when you do any kind of genealogical research, a lot of what you find can be classified into two categories. Actually, there's more than two categories, but we'll just simplify it here into direct evidence and indirect evidence. Most, if not all, the tips that I'll be giving here will fall into these two categories. There's going to be a little bit of overlap with some of them. For the most part, it'll be these two categories. So let's start by looking at some indirect evidence of Civil War veterans in your family tree. Indirect evidence.
I think of this as kind of like a clue that may be pointing you down the right path. You know the Hansel and Gretel story where they left breadcrumbs in the woods to find their way back? That's kind of what I talk about, like indirect evidence. Our ancestors left clues in these records, and it's up to us to figure out what to make of those clues. That's what indirect evidence is. The first piece of indirect evidence that we're going to look at is by looking at the typical age range for Civil War soldiers. The Civil War, it took place from 1861 to 1865. So as you're looking at your family tree, keep in mind, a lot of these soldiers were younger men that fought. So you want to look for soldiers that were born in the 1830s or maybe even into the early to mid 1840s. There were some older men that were in the war. It's unlikely that once you reached about the age 50 or older, pretty unlikely that you were in the war. There were some men of that age who did serve. That's going to be the exception and not the rule. So I would focus your search on anyone born after 1810, and even that is getting up there. But anything before 1810 is going to be pretty unlikely to have served. There were also very young men or boys that were in the war, but again, it's the exception. You're more likely to find these younger soldiers in the South. They were supposed to be 18 in the North. Sometimes the recruiter looked the other way and let them go. In the South, they weren't as strict on that, so you're more likely to find them there. If we're going by the 18-year-old range, by the end of the war, an 18-year-old would have been born about 1847. If you account for some of those underage ones, I would say you can go up to 1850. After that, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have a Civil War veteran. The second piece of indirect evidence, if you have an ancestor who disappeared between the 1860 and 1870 censuses, it might be because he died in the war. We can't say for sure, but that's a very good clue that he may have gone off to the war and died. So, for example, here's an 1860 census entry for the David Sprinkles family. David Sprinkles was in North Carolina, a farmer that owned $400 in real estate, living with his wife and 3 children. This was in 1860. 10 years later, in 1870, here's Mary, the female. She is now the farmer. She now owns the $400, and there's the children. Another daughter, Mary, came around 1862. So we know that David was there at least up through about 1861, 1862, and then there were no more children. This census record doesn't say what happened. We don't know. It's a pretty good piece of indirect evidence, a pretty good clue that he died, though, because she is the one now that owns the land. So I think she probably inherited that land from him after he died. It would take more research to find out. But since it was a young man that died in the 1860s, there's a good chance that he is a soldier that may have gone off to the war and died in the war. Another piece of indirect evidence would be gaps in the children's ages. So, for example, in this 1870s census entry for James Thompson, there's James and Elizabeth, and they have 5 sons. But if you look here, there's a gap right there between Joseph and James that corresponds with a lot of the years of the Civil War. Again, this is not direct evidence. It doesn't say on here that he was in the Civil War and was gone, because that may not have been the case. But it's definitely a possibility to look into. It's possible they may have had a child that died between 1862 and 1867. It's possible they just didn't have children. It's possible that Elizabeth is a second wife. First wife died after Joseph was born. He waited a couple years to get remarried and then had more kids. Those are all definite possibilities to look into. But because there is this 5-year gap in the children's ages, one possibility is that he may have been off at the war. Let's look at the good stuff now. These are the documents that are going to give you a direct answer to your question. These are those smoking gun documents that are going to give you the answer that you're looking for. The research question being, was my ancestor in the Civil War? if you have one of these smoking gun documents, it's going to directly answer yes or no. You'll find an exact answer to whether or not he was in the Civil War. Many of these resources we're about to look at can give you a pretty good answer. Some of them might require you to do a little maybe extra research, but you should get a pretty good start if you can look through all of these resources here. So my first suggestion is going to be to ask your relatives. I think this is a pretty basic one. I think a lot of us actually start out this way. You've either heard the stories growing up, or maybe you intentionally sought people out once you got interested. If you have grandparents still living, or aunts or uncles, your parents, a lot of them have heard these stories growing up about having an ancestor who was in the Civil War. I have found that a lot of family history stories have kind of gotten lost over time, but a lot of families still have these stories in their memory that are passed down about Civil War service. They were very proud of that. These soldiers kind of maintained that pride throughout their lifetime, and it became part of their identity in some cases. So some of those stories have still made it down to present day. So be sure you ask about them. And because I don't like you staring at just a blank screen here, I'm going to introduce you to my great-great-grandfather, John Timms. John was a Civil War veteran. I'm going to be using John Timms as an example for a lot of these suggestions that I have coming up. So I thought maybe you'd like to put a face to a name here. So this is John Timms. A lot of you know that the 1890 federal census was destroyed by a fire, but did you know there was a special census taken that year specifically for Union veterans and their widows? All those veterans should still be in there as long as either the soldier or the widow were still living in 1890. This was supposed to be specifically for Union veterans. So if you're looking for a Confederate, fortunately, you're going to be out of luck on this one. However, from time to time, the census taker would get confused and start writing down a Confederate name anyway. Usually they would catch the mistake and they would just cross it off. But the line that they would use to cross that off made the name still very readable. Most of the time you can still read the name that was there. So if you know where your ancestor was living in 1890, check the census regardless, because even if you're looking for a Confederate, you may get lucky and benefit from a census taker's mistake there. Unfortunately, there's one catch. These only exist for states that start with Kentucky through the end of the alphabet. Alphabetically, Alabama through Kansas, those were all destroyed for some reason. And really only about half of Kentucky still exists too. You can find these records on Ancestry. And if you don't have a paid subscription to Ancestry, you can go to Family Search and you can view these for free there. Here is an example of what a page from that census looks like. I know you can't read this very well. I'd be very impressed if you could, actually, because that's kind of some small print. But going to do you all a favor, and I enlarged it here. So let's look at line 4, Augustus Miller. Augustus Miller is my great-great-great-grandfather. Augustus Miller, I knew that he was living in Shalersville in Portage County, Ohio in 1890, so I looked for him in this census, and sure enough, there he was. If you are looking for a common named ancestor like a Miller, Augustus isn't extremely common, but there were several Augustus Millers in the Civil War. The fact that I knew he was in Shalersville in Portage County, I know this is him. And not only that, it actually gives you the name of the regiment too. And that's a great piece of information, because if you ever want to dig deeper into these people's service, the key piece of information is the name of the regiment, especially on a common named ancestor like Augustus Miller. I can see from here he was in Company F of the 100th Pennsylvania Volunteers, has his enlistment dates. When he was discharged, he served 1 year, 5 months, and 6 days. The line below it for Harlan Bradford, it says Eliza, widow of Harlan Bradford. So in this case, Harlan Bradford had already died. His widow was still alive. So he's enumerated in here under the name of his widow and the name of the soldier. The third suggestion, did you know that in 1910, the census just straight up asked if the person was in the Civil War? I used the 1910 federal census all the time for years and never knew it was in there. So they were specifically asked if they were part of the Union or Confederate military. You want to be careful though, because sometimes the census taker would use this for other notes. So I'm going to show you an example here. You want to look specifically for those letters there, and I'll show you the example here. This is a page from the 1910 Federal Census. Third to the last column asks whether a survivor of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy. You can see here, there are 4 men that have notations in that column. There's a 0, a UA, a 7, and a 4. Those numbers in this case don't mean anything. Those are notations that the census taker made that had nothing to do with the Civil War. And we know that because they were instructed to either write UA or UN for Union Army or Navy, or a CACN for Confederate Army or Navy. So because this man here had a UA on his census line, we know he was part of the Union Army. So don't get confused. This is a common mistake people make. They see a notation there and they get kind of excited until they realize it did not say UA or CN or anything. That's just a stray mark that the census taker put in that column. So 20 years later, in 1930, they actually asked something very similar in that same census record. It's been there all along. I didn't notice that at first either. It took me a while to realize they were asking about military service right on the census record. It was 1930. So there weren't a whole lot of Civil War veterans still alive at that point. The war had ended 65 years earlier. But for the ones that were still alive, they asked everybody, were you involved in a war? And if so, which one? So the ones that answered this, you're going to see a lot of World War I answers, a lot of Spanish-American War veterans. Those were fairly recent wars. A lot of those soldiers were still living. The Civil War veterans that were still alive got asked this question. If they were in the war, it should be recorded in there that, yes, they were in the Civil War. The 5th resource you can use to determine if your ancestor was in the Civil War is the National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors Database. I use this site literally almost every day. The great thing is it's a completely free site to use. The cool thing is, the reason I use this, every soldier from the Civil War on both sides should be represented in this database. You can filter your search depending on what state he was from. If you know he was like in the infantry or cavalry or something else, you can narrow down your search by that. As great as this site is, there is one drawback. That is that there isn't any biographical information about the soldiers in this index. You're just going to find a name and what state he fought from. So this is a great resource if your ancestor has a very unusual name, but no matter who you find in this index, you're going to need to do some extra research to confirm if you have the right soldier or not. This index is great, but it's only a starting point to know that there was someone in the Civil War with the same name as your ancestor. This is an example of what you find when you search on that database. Remember John Timms? I showed you his picture a couple minutes ago. I put his name in this database and this is what came up. Now, admittedly, I already know that he was in the Civil War, but let's just pretend that I didn't and I was starting my search on this site. I put John Timms in here. There's a lot of entries that come up. The top ones here, Mississippi and North Carolina, both in the Confederacy. Well, I know that my John Timms was from Ohio. So because he was from Ohio, he had to have fought for the Union. Probably. As long as he fought within Ohio, he was fighting for the Union. So I'm going to start my search by narrowing it down to the Union side and Ohio. And when I do that, this is what comes up. A lot less entries. You can see the top entries now show John Timms from Ohio in the 115th and also one in the 188th. That's a good starting point. Like I said, I would want to do some research to know, is there any other information out there that I can use about John Timms in the 115th or John Timms in the 188th to match to my ancestor? As it turns out, both of these men are the same guy. He served in 2 different units, so he's in here twice. And also, as it turns out, this happens to be my ancestor in both of these entries here. The 6th source that you can use to help determine if he was in the Civil War is obituaries. Hopefully, you know obituaries. They're really useful for genealogy research. They can be really useful because you can get some really good details about their life and what they did. especially for Civil War veterans. A lot of these soldiers were very proud of the fact that they were in the war, and obituaries is a good place to see that. In this obituary for John Tim's cousin Joseph, there are 5 sentences in here. One whole sentence. So 20% of his obituary is devoted to his Civil War service. It doesn't even list the name of his wife and all of his kids, but it says the name of his regiment, the 6th Ohio Light Artillery Independent Battery, listed in 1963. There's a great site. This is one that's totally free. The Library of Congress has digitized a lot of old newspapers and put it on their site called Chronicling America. And this also is in your handout. You can see LOC for libraryofcongress.gov. Not only can you find obituaries, but you can search just through a lot of old newspapers in general, and it's all searchable. You can put a name in there, and it'll find it in any newspaper that's scanned like that. And if you've never done research for your ancestors in these old newspapers, you need to do it, because you can find all kinds of really interesting details about their life. Sometimes more information than maybe you really wanted to know, but regardless, it's all interesting stuff in these old newspapers. So look, especially if you have Civil War service that you're specifically researching, put their name in there and see if they have an obituary and see if they're listed in there. So the 7th source that we can use to determine if your ancestor was in the Civil War would be grave sites. So along with this suggestion of looking at grave sites, I'm going to show you another free site. You maybe have heard of this, findagrave.com. It has millions of grave sites documented on there. Many of these have photos of the grave site itself. And that's where it becomes useful for Civil War researchers, when you can get those photos of the grave. And the reason is many of those soldiers are going to have Civil War information right on their headstones. Remember how we've already talked about how a lot of these Civil War soldiers were very proud of their service. It became part of their identity, and it was something that got passed down and remembered. Well, these gravestones are another place that we can find that. A lot of times you'll find regimental information right on the stone itself. You may find a military marker next to it. The GAR and the UCV, the Grand Army of the Republic, and the United Confederate Veterans were social organizations that a lot of soldiers belonged to later in life. And those organizations have marked a lot of those gravestones present day too. So here's some examples. But both of these pictures have government issued headstones. So it's got the regimental information right on there. But you can also see the GAR markers, the military markers, right next to the stones too. Then you get these kind of stones. Here's John Timms again, another familiar name. His stone, and then this one here. Neither one of these guys have regimental information on their stone, but they do have the GAR marker down there. So if you look just at the stone, you might not see it, but the GAR marker, the military markers, are there. Pension index cards is the next one we're going to talk about. I know when I very first started doing family history research, I had found some of these, but I really didn't know what they were or what they meant. This is simply an index card, an index entry, pointing to another set of records that will be at the National Archives. In this case, we're using another familiar name. John Timms shows up again. This is a pension index card with his name on it. But let's say you were starting from scratch and you didn't know if he was in fact in the Civil War or not, and you found this card with his name on it. Is there enough information on here to know for sure? Well, from this, we can figure out that he was in an Ohio regiment. This card shows that his wife's name was Mary A. Timms, and that she was living in Ohio when she filed for the widow's pension. All of this information matches what I know about my John Timms. But if we're being fair and open-minded, we can't say 100%. John and Mary, those are both very common names. There is a good chance there was another John Timms that married someone named Mary and lived in Ohio. It's possible, so we can't say for sure. But there is a way that we can get more information from these pension index cards. There are 2 versions of these cards out there. We were looking at the version that's on Ancestry.com. If you ever go to Fold 3 and look at their pension index cards, they have a completely different version of those same index cards on their site. So when you look at both of them together, you may be able to get enough information to put together to figure out this is your ancestor. I'll show you how that works here. Here's the one we just looked at from Ancestry. It includes the widow's name. Fold 3 does not include the widow's name, but Ancestry will. Just a little disclaimer there though. Ancestry will only include that widow's name if there was a widow left behind who filed for pension benefits. The only reason we know his widow was Mary is because she filed for a pension after he died. If she would have died first, there would be no widow's name listed. But in this case, we have a widow's name. On Fold 3 did not include the name of the widows, but in some cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, you can find death information there. So on this card, and I know it's the same soldier, see these file numbers line up: 172-326, 172-326, 987, 979, 987, 979. Those files all match up. This is the same soldier, just two different versions of the same card. I'm putting together that he was married to Mary and that this man died May 9th, 1912 in Ravenna, Ohio. That matches what I know of my John Timms. So I know that this is his Civil War pension index card. This tells me specifically that there is a pension file at the National Archives for him. But in general terms, this is pretty good direct evidence that he was in the Civil War. He wouldn't have gotten a Civil War pension if he was not in the Civil War, right? So this is direct evidence of that. Let's move on to draft registration records. Now, my experience is these are great records to use, but they're probably up there among some of the most misunderstood and misused records when it comes to Civil War research. So you have to be careful that you know what you're looking at here. The reason I say that is this is a draft registration record, but this is just simply a record of all of the men who registered for the draft. The draft was enacted in 1863 because they needed more soldiers. Any man of fighting age, like the 20s, age 20 to 30, into the early 40s, were required to register for the draft. From these lists, they would pick men to actually go fight. So we don't know from this list who actually got drafted. This is commonly misunderstood. This is not an enlistment record. This is not a record of the men signing up for the war. This is a record of the men who were registering for the draft. We just don't know from here whether or not they were drafted. But I'm including this in here because there is one instance where you can use this as direct evidence of Civil War service. In addition to all the names and ages and occupations and race, place of birth, all of that, this column here is what you want to look at. Former military service. Because this was 1863, some of these men had already served in the war. The war had started 2 years earlier. Some of these men had already been in the war and been discharged. And in those cases, they would record them in this register as former military service. So in this case, there's only 2 men on this page that have previous service mentioned. So in these cases, we can use this as direct evidence of Civil War service. But that's only because they had been in the war before the draft was done. We don't know from looking at this if they were drafted or not, but we know that these 2 men were previously in the war. So we can use this as direct evidence. So you can use these registers to determine if your ancestor may have been in the war. It's just not completely conclusive in a lot of cases. So the next resource to use are those online family trees that you find typically on Ancestry, but a lot of other sites have them too. And I want to say right up front that you really need to use these with caution. Sometimes they're great. Sometimes they're 100% accurate, but sometimes they're not. I use these trees as inaccurate as I find them sometimes. And this is not a slam on Ancestry or anything. This is just a word of warning to verify anybody else's research. You don't know if they've sat down for the first time that day and started building a tree, or if they have years of experience in research. and they built the tree with really solid sources. We just don't know. But these trees can have clues. They can be verified. If you find a probate record or a land record attached to your ancestor, that means somebody at some point thought that was his and attached it there. So why reinvent the wheel? Sometimes I use this as a starting point, or if I get stuck, and I can do my homework and verify that those resources are correct. All that being said, here is my great-great-grandfather, John Timms again. Here is his record on an online family tree on Ancestry. It took 2 pages. If you scroll down, somebody at some point found a grave registration for a soldier that attached to him and a pension index card that was attached to him. So this is another case that if I did not already know if John Timms was in the Civil War, and these were the first things I was finding, I could go and look at this pension index card and see if it matched up to be him. Again, do your homework, but somebody else thought at some point this could be him. So check for your ancestors' records on these online family trees to see if that's a good starting point for you to work with. The next source, number 11, the local historical societies, a very underutilized resource, I think. There's a good chance somebody at some point in your county's history in the 150, 160 years since the Civil War, somebody has taken it upon themselves, taken interest in the Civil War and these veterans, and document a lot of the veterans who served or were buried from your county. If you live too far away to go in person to the historical society where your ancestor is from, if you're like me and sometimes you're up at midnight looking things up, or if you are a socially distant researcher at this point, here's a workaround for some of this. You're not going to get all those local records, but a lot of counties published county histories, most of them in the 1880s. So there may be a county history published about that county. They're going to be in the local historical society, but Google Books have scanned, digitized a lot of these old county history books because they're in the public domain. So go to Google Books, see if there's a county history. Here's an example: History of Portage County, Ohio in 1885, an old dusty looking book there. Inside that book, there is an entire chapter devoted to Civil War veterans. And you can see lists of soldiers who served in all the different regiments and companies and what they did. But looked on Google Books, and I found this exact same page digitized on Google Books. So don't forget to look on Google. Google can be your friend in this case. They've done a lot of the work for you. A lot of times they're fully searchable. The last resource. This one's going to take a little more work on your part. This is not something that you can easily do from home, but this may be a new resource for you to try. That would be Homestead Files. The Homestead Act was passed during the Civil War, and this is the URL for the index right here. It's definitely worth going to and looking at if you haven't been to that site before. Homestead Act was passed during the Civil War. It was an effort to encourage settlement. Most of it was west of the Mississippi. You had to live on your land for 5 years, make the necessary improvements, prove that you made the improvements, and then you get title to the land free of charge. But the reason this connects to Civil War veterans, if you were in the Union Army, they didn't do this for the Confederates. If you were in the Union Army, you could count your time in the war toward that 5-year period. So if you served a 3-year term in the Civil War, you would only have to spend 2 years out on your land before your 5 years was up, and then you get that land for free. So what you did, you find a lot of Civil War soldiers taking advantage of this. Not every Civil War veteran was a homesteader. Not every homesteader was a Civil War veteran, but it's definitely worth looking into. If you find indirect evidence of your Civil War ancestor moving west after the war, it's worth looking into to see if he was a homesteader. The Homestead Files are kept at the National Archives. You can find the state of Nebraska on Ancestry. This is the kind of entry that you get. This is the index that you get, I should say. This is an index for all federal land, not just homesteaders. But if you see a mention of him being a homesteader, you want to get his packet, because within that packet, if he was a homesteader, you can find information about his Civil War service. This man here, right in his homestead packet, says that he was in Company G of the 34th Iowa Volunteers. Talks about how long he served, for 3 years. This was all documented in there so he could get that 3 years shaved off of his 5-year homestead time. He also found this letter in there written from one of his comrades in war there. He enrolled on the 11th day of August, 1862 to serve 3 years. Talks about when he was discharged. Even gives a physical description of him. 27 years old, 5 feet, 7.5 inches tall, dark complexion, dark eyes, dark hair. So these homestead packets are worth getting even if he wasn't a veteran. But if you are specifically looking to see if he was a Civil War veteran, check his homestead packet if he does in fact have one. Okay, so here's the thing though. These tips will work really great if you have an ancestor with a unique name like Norval Wyckoff or Hezekiah Comstock, Esau Blodgett. Those are some pretty unique names that if that's your ancestor, you're not going to have to do a whole lot of work. What happens though, if you have an ancestor named Thomas Davis or Andrew Wilson, David Miller, John Thompson, what happens when you have ancestors with really common names like that? It gets a lot more tricky to do research on these men here. I want to share with you a situation like this that I was faced with a while back. A gentleman contacted me asking for help in finding his ancestors' Civil War records. No problem, I thought. Let's start with the basics. What was his name? Turns out the soldier's name was William Smith. Okay, so this is going to be a little tricky. He didn't know what regiment he was in. So we will be looking for that proverbial needle in a haystack, finding William Smith, who was in the Civil War. So we thought maybe we can narrow this down with a little more background information. His wife's name was Mary. Do you know how many William Smiths with a wife named Mary? Do you know how many of them were in the Civil War? I don't know, but I'm guessing there were hundreds and hundreds of men with this name married to Mary in the Civil War. So sure, that helps a little bit, but it doesn't help a whole lot. Turns out he did know a little more background information on him. William's middle name was Carroll, so that's a little more unusual. So that could be a lead. He knew when he was born, when he died, and he knew that he lived in White County, Illinois during the war and during his adult life. So that helps narrow it down. We've got exact dates of birth and death. We know that William Carroll Smith was born in Tennessee and at some point moved to Illinois. That migration pattern is a little more unusual. So that could really help narrow down looking for a William Smith living in Illinois, married to Mary, who was born in Tennessee. It's still going to be tricky, but we might have enough here to help narrow this down. So let's look at this list of resources that we just talked about. Using the background information that he gave me, see if we can find him in the indexes here. I asked him if he could ask around and see if anybody knows any more background information. Are there any, documents floating out there or stories out there that they know that, oh yeah, he was in the 19th Illinois or, the 3rd Illinois Cavalry or something like that. If we can get any piece of information like that, it's going to really help. So he promised to ask around. A couple days later, he got back with me. He asked around. Nobody knows anything. He just said that his great aunt is certain that he really was in the war. So it's a good first step. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a dead end. The second piece of information, second resource rather, would be the 1890 Veteran Census. If you remember, this is supposed to list every surviving soldier or their widow, along with the regiment that they were in. This could answer a lot of questions for a lot of the soldiers out there. So I was excited maybe we could find something in there. And then I remembered these only exist for states alphabetically K through Z. We're looking for a soldier from Illinois. That falls on the wrong side of that alphabetical list there. There are no surviving census records, the veteran census records for Illinois. That would have been great. However, this is also a dead end. Let's look at the 1910 federal census. If you remember, everybody was asked, were you in the Civil War? So we thought if he was still alive, which he was, he should be in here. And maybe we can at least confirm if he was even in the war or not. This is the 1910 federal census for White County, Illinois. William Smith is right here. I know you can't read that very well. I'll enlarge it here. But it does say William C. Smith, married to Mary, born in Tennessee, living in Illinois. He's the right age. This appears to be him. So let's look to see what he said about his Civil War service. This right here is where it should indicate any service. It's completely blank. So whoever supplied this information did not include anything about his Civil War service. So unfortunately, this was also a dead end. But it got me wondering, was this man really even in the Civil War? So I went back to the client and asked him, are you sure he was in the Civil War? What evidence do you have that shows that he really was in the war? He sent me this. He said, this man right here in the shades, that's William Smith. Behind him is Mary Smith. He said, this is a photo that's been in the family. It's always been believed that this was a Civil War reunion picture. I agree, it does look like that. And he said this has been some of their concrete evidence that he really was in the Civil War. Okay, let's look at that 1930 census then. In 1930, everybody that was alive was asked, were you in the military? If you remember, though, William died in 1929. So he just missed it. So he is not even recorded in this census. So we can't get any information from that. So this was also a dead end. The fifth place we can look is that National Parks Service database of all the soldiers and sailors who were in the Civil War. And I did that. I typed in William C. Smith. I narrowed it down to Illinois soldiers in the Union. Got a lot of entries. There was a lot of men named William C. Smith who fought in Illinois. So this first entry, this could be him. There was a William C. Smith who was in the 8th Illinois Infantry. That could be him. There's no other information on here for me to use to match him up. So I guess this is also a needle in a haystack kind of approach. I could broaden the search to just William Smith without the middle initial, but you can imagine that's going to show even more entries, and it's going to give us even more to wade through. So this is not extremely helpful when you have common named ancestors, and it didn't really help in this case either. I looked for a man named Carroll Smith. There was a man named Carroll Smith who fought in Illinois and the 63rd Illinois Infantry. And that could be him. Again, I don't know for sure, but I think this was the first real lead that I had that this may be him. So I'm going to put a pin in this one, keep track of the fact that there was a man named Carroll Smith in the 63rd Illinois. That could be him. I don't know. It could be. I looked for obituaries, number 6 on that list. I went over to Chronicling America, that free newspaper site, did a search for William C. Smith in Illinois in 1929, because that's the year that he died, hoping that maybe there was an obituary. You look down here, 0 results for William C. Smith in Illinois in 1929. I looked for Carroll Smith and had the same kind of thing, 0 results for Carroll Smith in 1929 in Illinois. So, unfortunately, I was hoping to get military information in an obituary, but this also turned out to be a dead end. Number 7, gravesite information. And you know what? On this one, I got lucky. I got a hit. I found his gravesite. This all matched up. This was in Illinois. He was buried in Union Ridge Cemetery in White County, Illinois. And if you remember, the descendant had told me he knew that he had lived in White County, Illinois for the rest of his life. So that lined up. We knew that his wife was Mary. We knew that he was born in 1943 and died in 1929. And this right here, Carroll, kind of an uncommon name. This tells me that this was probably him. And it looks like he did use the name Carroll in this case. He was buried under that name. However, even though I think I found him on the gravesite, it didn't really help me a whole lot because I was hoping there would be a military marker to confirm that he was in the war, maybe some kind of regimental information. None of that was there. So, yeah, this is him, but I didn't really didn't really get any solid leads from this. So unfortunately, that was also a dead end. The pension index cards. I looked in the pension indexes on Ancestry to see if there was anyone named William C. Smith, and this came up. In this case, it said the widow was named Sarah, so that doesn't seem to be him. But this one also came up. William C. Smith with no widow listed, fighting in Illinois, so that could be him. But this one also came up, and so did this one. This time he is married to Mary, so this one could be him. This one might be him. This came up, and this one, and this one. It's expanding out into other states now, but that could be him. That came up. That one, that one, that one. I started looking for Carol Smith, and this came up. There was a Carol Smith. Carol Smith again. I remember again, I was looking, maybe hoping to find that man in the 63rd Illinois that I thought could be him. This one came up. This one came up. None of these pension cards even showed a Carol Smith who fought in the 63rd Illinois. So it appears that that man, even though he was in the war, never applied for a pension. So this is, again, a needle in a haystack kind of approach. So unfortunately, this also turned out to be a dead end. Moving over to the draft registrations, as you can imagine, with a name like William Smith, there are going to be a lot of entries. And I typed that in there. There was line after line after line in the index of William Smith. Honestly, I didn't even find the draft registration for him because there were so many to go through that I wasn't sure which of them were him. And do you remember with those draft registrations, they usually don't even tell you if he was in the war or not. If he had previously served, it would say that. But this seemed like a lot of work for very little reward in this case. So I didn't even track down the draft registration because there were so many of them. So this was a dead end. Looking at the online family trees to see if anybody else had found anything that they thought would be the correct service information for him. Looking on Ancestry, this was one of the online family trees for him. Looking through here, though, nobody in any of those online family trees attached any military information. So no one knew whether he was in the war or not. And if they did know, they didn't know which one was him either. So this, unfortunately, was also a dead end. Are you seeing a trend here? These are all dead ends. Historical societies. I'll be honest again, I was not about to write to White County, Illinois Historical Society and ask them, do you have any information about William Smith in the Civil War? Because I'm sure that they do. Because there were people named William Smith who served in the Civil War from White County, Illinois. But they'd be faced with the same dilemma I was. How do they even know it's him? So in this case, I looked on Google Books to see if White County, Illinois had one of those county histories. And sure enough, they do. So I looked in there to see if there was anyone named William Smith from White County, Illinois in the Civil War. I found this list, a man named William Smith. But the same problem we keep having. We know that there was a man named William Smith in the war. I don't know if it's him. This was also in there. William I. Smith, probably not him. But again, I don't know for sure. There was another man that showed up from White County, Illinois in this book. This man died in 1864, so I can cross this man off. I know that he was not in the 5th Cavalry. But really, unfortunately, this kind of also turned into a dead end because I was not able to match him up with anything that I already knew. The last thing on my list was the homestead records. If you remember, Civil War soldiers a lot of times took advantage of this act, and you can find Civil War information in his homestead file. But I have no evidence that he ever bought land, ever moved west. He stayed in Illinois as far as I know. So for me to search for William Smith in the homestead records, I guarantee you I'd find dozens of them. But I have no evidence that he even took advantage of that. So that last thing on my list also turned into another dead end. So I was faced with really wanting to help this man out, really wanting to find his ancestor, but faced with a situation of, I've exhausted all my resources. Now what do we do? I started thinking about it, and maybe there was a clue that I overlooked. what new information did we find? I went back to that gravesite because really that's about the only thing that I really found that really I could nail down to him. All those other things were maybe they were him, I can't match him to anything. So let's look at this. And I looked at this and realized there is a clue on this gravestone that I overlooked at first. So put your genealogical thinking caps on. What do you see a clue on here that can maybe help us moving forward? The gravestone says his birth and death date, which we knew. It says his wife's name and dates of birth and death, which I guess was new information. I really didn't know a whole lot about that. He went by the name Carroll, which I kind of picked up on earlier from that. He was buried in White County, Illinois. All this stuff is what this gravestone is telling us. But there's one piece on here. She died before him. You see that? She died in 1928. He died in 1929. You may be asking yourself, why is that significant to Civil War research? Because there shouldn't be a widow's name on a pension index card. If she died first, he was most likely single when he died, widowed. So there wouldn't be anyone left to apply for that pension on his behalf. So any of those pension index cards that have a widow's name at all are not going to be him. So let's go back and look at those again. Remember all those pension index cards? We found like 20 of them. Let's look at those again. And this time we're going to be looking for William Smith, also known as Carroll Smith. No known widow. So let's look at those pension cards and see what we can come up with. This was one that I thought could have been him, William C. Smith with widow Mary A. Smith. That all matches up. He was fighting from Illinois. But if you remember, she died first. There shouldn't be a widow on his pension card. So this is not him. We can get rid of that one. This one could be him. William C. Smith fought in the 6th Illinois Cavalry. This one might be him. Going to put a pin in that one too and see if we can get any more information about that. So as we go through all of these, this one, he was in a U.S. infantry. He could have enlisted from Illinois. He filed for a pension from Illinois. I guess this could be him too. So after going through all of those, it took a long time to go one by one through those. I had it narrowed down to a couple finalists that could be him. I had this one, William C. Smith in the 18th Illinois, William C. Smith in the 6th Cavalry, William C. Smith in the 19th Illinois, or Carroll Smith in the U.S. Infantry, and another Carroll Smith in the U.S. Infantry. So out of all those pension index cards, I had it narrowed down to 5 potential ones. But I wanted to go one step further. I wanted to know which one of these is him. So what do we do at this point? We have 5 candidates that could be him. Where do we go? And then I remembered. Remember back earlier in the presentation, I kept telling you all about John Timms. He had 2 pension index cards. On Ancestry, it includes the widow's name, if there was one. Fold 3, a lot of times, includes the death information. So maybe, if we get lucky, our William C. Smith had a second pension card that gives the dates of his death and location. Let's look at those 5 candidates that we had. This was William C. Smith in the 19th Illinois. He was one of our top 5 candidates. On fold 3, his card says that he died in 1917 in Omaha, Nebraska. I know that our man died in 1929, so that's not him. So we can get rid of this one now. How about this man, Carroll Smith in the U.S. Infantry? Fortunately, there's no death information on this one, so this one is still in the running. How about this one, William Smith in the 6th Illinois Cavalry? We have a date of death, December 5th, 1929 in Norris City, Illinois. Match that up to what we know, December 8th, 1929. It's off by 3 days. My thinking was a 5 is only one little swish line away from being an 8. That could be a transcription error. Very easily could be him. Everything matches up too perfectly. Is that just a coincidence? I don't know. But we know that he was buried in White County, Illinois. This man died in Norris City, Illinois. So I Googled where Norris City was. Norris City is a village in White County, Illinois. Very small town, population 1,275. So I think that's him. So the next time I was at the National Archives, I requested the pension file for William C. Smith of the 6th Illinois Cavalry. And they brought me his entire pension file. Looking through it, I found this, the declaration for a pension. This is when he applied for his pension. I know you can't read that either. Let's enlarge this line. Since leaving the service, he has resided in White and Gallatin counties, Illinois. That matches up with our guy. See right here, last known residence, White County, Illinois. This was the clincher right here. He was born September 17th, 1843 in Nashville, Tennessee, which matches up exactly with what we know of our guy. So, William C. Smith, that we kept thinking was all those dead ends, he was the wanted man. I found him. Using those principles there and analyzing the evidence to see something that you missed on the first glance. It was that date of death for the wife that really cemented this in place, that helped me go from this being a wanted man to a found man. Let me address real quick, though, a couple questions that you might have, because I know I had them when I was finished with this. One being, why was he not included in that 1910 census? The answer is, I don't know. Was it that the person that supplied the information just didn't know that he was in the Civil War? Could it be that the census taker got the information but just forgot to list it down? I don't know. But that happens sometimes. Another question, why did the gravestone say Carroll Smith when his Civil War papers said William Smith? I thought for sure that I would be looking for Carroll Smith. As it turns out, his Civil War papers have him listed as William Smith. I'm certain I found him, all the information matched up under William Smith. I know it's not unusual for men to sometimes use their middle name interchangeably with their first name. Maybe he informally went by Carroll Smith, but for his official Civil War papers, he put William Smith. The point is, though, when you're doing research like this, you can't always take things at face value. If you rely on just one piece of information to draw your conclusion and move forward, you might be heading down the wrong path. There could be a mistake in that document, like we found. And you have to compile your evidence, compare, analyze it, figure out which is the most accurate. So if you have any questions, you can let me know. I will be around. Here's my email address, website address. I have a feature right on my website. It's a free feature. If you go there, there's a tab that says what's available from My Ancestor. Type in what you know. I'll get back with you, help you find them in the index. It doesn't usually take as long as what we just showed here. Usually it's a lot easier, but I can let you know if he shows up in the index, what might be available for him at the National Archives. It's a free service that I'm offering.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause it there and come back to you live. You're on mute, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that was amazing. I seeing the case study and oh wow, that was incredible.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, we did have one question.
Okay.
Desiree asks, how helpful is this in slave ancestors? Are there any archivist names?
There was two parts to that. How helpful is that? I think a lot of the records that I mentioned, it shouldn't matter if they were white or black or enslaved or free. I don't think it matters so much in most of those records. Even the Homestead records wasn't limited by race. There were African Americans that took advantage of the Homestead Act. I'm just trying to think if there's any difference in the record keeping. I can't think of any significant differences. Draft registrations, unless they were a free person, they probably wouldn't be showing up in the draft records. But I think for the most part, the resources that I mentioned, it probably wouldn't matter so much whether they were slave or free or white or black. Second part of the question, any archivist names, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking there.
Okay, I'll go back to part one of that question.
Sure.
Pre-pandemic, I happened to do some research on my own, and my maiden name is Dantzler.
Okay,
That's a huge plantation in South Carolina,
okay,
and it is a national landmark in South Carolina.
okay,
By chance, I happened to find an officer with the last name of Dantzler.
okay,
Of course, he was white. The headstone is tremendous. His side of the family has done a lot of research and posted a lot of pictures of him and his headstone and I guess family.
okay,
I thought it was very rare that any slaves under slave owners were even allowed to participate in the Civil War. And secondly, were never granted any type of restitution or pensions from the government.
okay.
I'll have you answer that first.
Okay. A lot of slaves did join the Union Army.
Yes.
Yeah, they were part of the U.S. colored troops. They weren't allowed to fight until 1863. So before then, it's very rare to find any African Americans in the Civil War.
Okay.
But I would look around in there. It's if you've done African American genealogy research, which it sounds like you have, you know it's not uncommon for them to choose their own last name once they're freed. And so if you find the formerly enslaved going by the last name of the plantation owner, that's a good clue that's where they came from, but that's not always the case. Have you done work to see if they did get a pension? It sounds like from what you said, they weren't in the pension indexes, right?
I have not done any work to find out if
Okay.
there were any, as you say, Civil War ancestors,
Okay,
or if there were any pensions allotted
okay,
to African American soldiers.
definitely, yes. There were about 180,000 African Americans who fought in the U.S. colored troops, and many of them did at least apply for pensions. Not all of them were granted, but the applications are on file at the National Archives. And in many cases, you get some great genealogical information because they tell sometimes where they were enslaved, what town, who was enslaving them. Sometimes you get information about family members. So I would definitely look into that to see. And if they happened to maybe fight under one name, change their name later in life, many times they're both listed in the index too.
Wow.
They're going to be filed under both names.
So the very first place I would start is which site?
To find if he got a pension or to find if he was in the war at all.
Both.
I would start with that National Park Service database. Type
Okay.
that last name that you mentioned. I forget, started with a D, I forget what it was, but type that in there. See if any of them are showing up. You can narrow it down by the U.S. colored troops.
Okay.
See if he's showing up.
Okay.
If you have that, that's going to answer you because that's going to be broader than the pension index because not all soldiers applied for pensions, but they should all be in that database, this National Park Service database. So I would start with that.
Good. Okay. And this is a strange question that applies to anyone. If there was there such a thing as unclaimed funds for pensions during that time that have carried over to today?
I've never heard of that happening. No,
Mhm.
no. If they didn't claim their funds, they would follow up. And most of the time they find out that the pensioner died. If they just stopped claiming their money, I never heard of unclaimed money going to anybody today. If you find that out, let me know. That'd be interesting, but I've never heard of it. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
And from Audrey, can we request National Archive records online and receive files in an email?
Yes, I think they do that. I will tell you there is a massive backlog. If you request them directly from the National Archives, there's a backlog everywhere. All the private researchers, everybody that does this on site has a backlog right now, but I think they do it through email. You're welcome to send me an email, go through my website because I provide the same service at a cheaper rate, and you will probably get it quicker. And I also deliver them through the email. So I could probably help you get those files too.
A lot of very positive comments. Alicia, our South Korea guest, said, excellent presentation. I learned so much. Take care of yourself and try raw honey for your throat. So
Thank
it was
you.
important to mention that.
Thank you. I have a follow-up appointment with my doctor tomorrow to see if he can improve my voice. So I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna actually take a save this chat, so I'm gonna send that to you as well, because there are some very, very nice comments here.
Okay.
Everybody seemed to enjoy it a lot and learned a lot. Alicia also asked, have you checked the Freedmen's Bureau records? Maybe that was for
Probably
Desiree.
directed to Desiree there. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely worth checking. Yeah, definitely worth checking the Freedmen Bureau's records.
Okay, and Pat said an uncle served, but I believe that his brother, my second great grandfather, did not. Do any records give some sort of reason for exemption for not serving?
Not necessarily. I'm trying to think if there's an men weren't required to serve. So the reason for not serving might just be that they weren't drafted. They registered for the draft, but their number wasn't chosen. So that happens. So there might not be this big explanation as far as any kind of exemption other than he just didn't get drafted. I'm trying to think. I'm not familiar. There may be some kind of obscure records there where men filed for exemptions, but I'm not familiar with what they would be offhand. So.
Okay, and Larry said the local history division at the Rundell Library in Rochester has a partial list of people who paid a bounty to others to serve in their place. It can be used in person, not online. So that's interesting. Is that,
Yeah.
Larry, is that for just local veterans of the Civil War, or?
Oh, yeah, here, it was partially started by a volunteer who used to work there, and I don't think she ever finished it.
Mhm.
But it's worth checking. You never know.
And Eileen said her 3 times great grandfather was paid to serve for someone else. Interesting.
That definitely happened a lot. Once the draft came around, you could pay someone to serve in your place.
So would they be registered under the wrong name then?
No, the paperwork, they didn't care how you got there. Once you got there, you were under your own name for all your
Okay.
records, all your pensions.
Okay,
So, yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
You
a
may
lot of,
find, you may find a mention of that, like in the enlistment papers, that he's hired by somebody else, but yeah, all the records would be under that actual name.
okay, interesting. Any other questions? This is being recorded, so we'll have it on our YouTube channel for 30 days. So if you want to watch this over again, which I'm going to definitely do, it should be up by next week, but I'll let you know that for sure.
Cool.
I have one question.
Sure.
Brian, can you tell us, help us a little bit more to understand? I think it goes along with a question or a statement that two other people mentioned where someone was able to serve in their place. In my research, I've learned that if a slave owner had 10 or more slaves, he was exempted from serving in the war. Can you expound on that, please?
You know what? That very well may be true. I don't know for sure, and here's the reason why. That would be if they were enslaving people, that would mean they were going to be for the Confederacy. I don't have as much experience with the Confederate records because I do most of my stuff on site, the National Archives, where all the Union Army stuff is. So you may be correct on that. I can't confirm either way on that one for sure because the records aren't there at the National Archives. So that may be true.
Okay.
Where are the records?
Those records, any of the Confederate records are most likely going to be at the individual state archives. you think about it, the federal government, the National Archives houses things that the federal government originally had.
Right.
The Confederacy was technically not part of the US federal government. The individual states are responsible for that. So including all the pension files, if you have a Confederate ancestor and you want to look for that, look in the state archives instead of the National Archives.
All right. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I actually have a part 2 of this presentation that talks about the records that are available once you find that Civil War ancestor. So if you ever need to fill a slot for speaking again,
Okay.
you want Civil War, let me know and we can do part 2. So
All right. Sounds good. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll be trying to get our 2022 schedule going pretty soon.
Good,
So,
good. Hurry up.
all right. Leslie says, yes, please. Yeah, a few people are definitely
Oh.
interested in that.
Do you guys have any questions later on? My website's fairly easy to remember, civilwarrecords.com. I'm always open to helping people out if you need, guidance in the right direction. So let me know.
So you said this changed from Rhinehart Roots to Civil War Records. So do you have
That's right.
two websites, or does the Rhinehart Roots, is that,
That's my old website, but if you go there by mistake, or if you happen to communicate with me before and you have that bookmark and go there, it automatically will redirect to civilwarrecords.com.
that was the word I was looking for, redirect?
There you go. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. I know in Rochester it's a beautiful night, so I appreciate that you came and took part in our genealogy presentation. Brian, can't thank you enough. This was an awesome presentation.
Thank
Really,
you.
somebody said one of the best. I would agree. This was just phenomenal. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, and good luck with your throat. Hope you get
Yeah.
good news from the doctor tomorrow. And yeah, Eileen said LeVar Burton was on Jeopardy.
Hey.
So
You missed
people
Jeopardy
watch
for
this
this.
instead of LeVar Burton.
Hey, I'll take it.
All right. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful night, and I will be in touch with a follow-up email and let you know what's coming up in August.
All right,
Have a
thanks,
great night.
everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Uproar among the enslaved, if that's the